Thank you, Frank. And good morning. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here. My name is Stephanie Osten. I'm a field consultant at Marquette. I work primarily with Marquette's not-for-profit clients, where we spend a good bit of our time discussing fiduciary education.
And I'm Linsey Payne. I'm also on the consulting team, and I'm a recovering attorney, so this is right in my wheelhouse. Before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for not using this time to check your emails or schedule a dentist appointment. It means you see some value in hearing us talk about fiduciary best practices for the next 15 minutes or so. Don't worry, we're not going to bore you with a bunch of legal jargon. We're really here to give you the quick and dirty Cliff's Notes version on how to be a good fiduciary, and hopefully provide you with some tools that you can use at your next committee meeting. And for all of you that are too young to know what Cliff's Notes are, you can basically think of it as the first form of AI. I will cover the who, the what, and the when, and then I'll turn things back to Stephanie to talk about the how-tos. Let's get started. According to another ancient relic, Webster's Dictionary, a fiduciary is a party to a relationship, but it's a very unique relationship, one that is centered around trust and reliance and has influence over decision-making. Someone is giving you responsibilities or discretion over assets, and they're trusting that you in turn will do the right thing. Sometimes this duty is clear as day. It's outlined in a contract or in investment bylaws, but it's not always that obvious. Sometimes just the nature of the relationship or the conduct between the parties is what creates that fiduciary duty. So who does this really apply to? Well, we're in Chicago, so we're gonna have a little Oprah moment. It's fiduciary duties for everyone. Everyone in this room is probably a fiduciary in some form or fashion, and you work with fiduciaries, so you can think about these concepts through those multiple lenses. So remember, the key elements here are reliance, trust, and influence. So let's start with the most obvious. Board members, investment committee trustees, all of these individuals are considered fiduciaries, even non-voting members. That's because they have a seat at the table and they exert influence, so that triggers that fiduciary status. The same applies to staff. Even if that individual doesn't have the final say in the decision making, they're usually the one that's signing off on behalf of the organization or implementing those investment changes, moving assets around. That comes with fiduciary obligation. And then comes the service providers. These will all be fiduciaries to the extent that they are providing their services. Stephanie's going to talk a little bit about delegation, and this is really an example of that. These services can be delegated, that fiduciary duty can be delegated, but the original fiduciary must maintain that duty to monitor. Now, just because you have a contract in place with your service provider does not mean that they're automatically a fiduciary. Actuaries, accountants, you're going to get a lot of data from them that you're going to rely upon, but it does not come with a fiduciary obligation, so that's important to keep in mind. The same applies to stakeholders. There may be strong opinions or a lot of influence exerted by these individuals, but they are not wearing a fiduciary hat. So when you are wearing that fiduciary hat, what does that mean? It's really an alphabet soup when it comes to standards of conduct. You've got MIFA, ERISA. For purposes of today, we're just going to refer to common law principles. It's really going to depend on the organization. But even across these standards, you can kind of boil down fiduciary obligations to two main duties, the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. The duty of care is also known as the prudent person rule. The takeaway here is that you can't plead ignorance. And so if you're making a decision and maybe it's not quite in your wheelhouse, you might want to phone a friend, and that's often where we come in as investment consultants. Then comes the duty of loyalty. So fiduciaries cannot put their interest or the interest of third parties ahead of the person that is owed that duty. Here's where things can get a little tricky, especially when you combine it with the duty of care. If you're sitting on an investment committee, for example, you're probably there because you know a thing or two about investments. That might also mean you have a lot of connections in the investment industry. So making sure that there's not a conflict of interest or even a perceived conflict of interest is key, and we'll talk a little bit about how to go around that. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, the good news is that courts recognize this is a lot easier said than done. And so rather than focusing on the ultimate outcome and the decision that these fiduciaries make, the focus is on the process and the road that's taken to reach that decision. So keeping a paper trail, showing that you have a process in place with an investment policy statement, monitoring that with a report every quarter. These are all things that, from a paper trail perspective, allow you to show that you have a process and you're following it. And then focus on things that you can control. And some of this low-hanging fruit means being a good, prudent person, doing your homework in advance of the meetings, asking those questions from your service providers, disclosing potential conflicts of interest before they may arise and become questionable, and then knowing how your organization operates, both standalone and relative to peers. Now, a good process can go a long way, but if there is a fiduciary breach, the stakes are high. In addition to personal liability, the organization itself could have an impact. So for example, a nonprofit could lose its tax-exempt status if there's a fiduciary breach. The biggest risk, though, is reputational. We're talking about trust here, which takes a long time to build. So if that's eroded, that's going to have lasting implications for the organization. Bringing this back to the investment committee, there's a lot of decision making and a lot of opportunity to put on your fiduciary hat. So when it comes to selecting who is on your committee, putting together the asset allocation and the investment policy statement, and then monitoring the success of that program, that's all going to require good process and good structure. And fortunately, we have Stephanie here to walk us through on how to do this the right way.
Thanks, Linsey. I think that's all super helpful and lays the groundwork well for the next part of our discussion. The title of this flash talk is What Makes a Good Fiduciary? And in the spirit of trying to answer that question, we're going to focus on talking about a few tools to help you do that well. First, we'll talk about the traits successful committees have in common, and then we're going to walk through a framework designed to help you be a good fiduciary. At Marquette, our consultants work with a lot of committees. Now, every committee is different, but successful ones do have a few things in common. These groups are organized, engaged, and focused. Organized, meaning that materials are sent out in advance, allowing committee members to prepare and show up to meetings engaged. They're focused on the order of the day, not sidetracked by personal interests. If I can give you one piece of advice, keep your agendas manageable. I think we all know that feeling of dread that comes on us when we open up an investment meeting packet and have about 8 agenda items to cover, as well as the usual investment report, all in the space of a 60-minute Zoom meeting. Be realistic. Give material the time it deserves. Finally, if your committee doesn't already have an annual self-assessment, I'd suggest incorporating one just to check in and see on how things are going. Now we're going to take the responsibilities that Linsey outlined and organize them into a straightforward framework of governance, oversight, and enrichment. Governance should clearly lay out the structure of the investment program. This involves defining the objective of the investments and outlining it in the policy. I'll note here that without good governance in place, oversight is not particularly meaningful, so spend good time getting this in place first. Oversight lies at the core of your fiduciary responsibilities. As Linsey mentioned, this includes monitoring portfolios to ensure they align with policy and that the investments remain on track. Finally, at the peak of our pyramid is enrichment. Markets change, memories fade, and it's important that groups take the time to really invest in education. This ensures groups remain engaged, informed, and effective. Now we're going to work our way up through the fiduciary framework, starting with digging into governance. Here we've laid governance out as a process. This emphasizes that it is not a set it and forget it task, but rather the ongoing work of the committee. Here we'll talk about the investment objective as the destination and the portfolio strategy that's used to get there as the journey. Pension funds, endowments, operating funds, All these portfolios have different destinations. And just as the plan you'd make to head to the lake house for the weekend is going to look different than the plan you'd take to travel to Hawaii, the strategy used to implement each of these portfolios will also vary. Once you've clearly defined the destination, you'll then lay the travel plan out in the investment policy statement. This should clearly define responsibilities and explain the vehicles that will be used along the way to get you there. Now, most of us can pack up the car and head to the lake house with little assistance, but we would need the help of a trained airline pilot to get us safely and efficiently to Hawaii. This brings us to an important concept called the fiduciary line. The fiduciary line marks the division between the strategy and the execution of the investment program. Above the line lie your essential responsibilities. This includes defining the objective of the investments, articulating it in the policy, and ongoing oversight. Now, below the line, and we'll let Jess focus again, lies the implementation, resourcing, execution, resourcing, and implementation of the investment program. This is typically carried out by staff, consultants, investment managers. As Linsey explained, these tasks can be delegated, but ultimate responsibility still lies with the committee. This emphasizes the importance of a well-written investment policy statement that clearly delegates authority to these individual parties. Back above the line, it is then your responsibility to superintend, through ongoing monitoring and oversight, the implementation of the investment program. Now, bringing it full circle, it's the ongoing work of the group to evaluate the objective and make sure you remain on track to reach the destination. We'll dig a bit further into oversight here, breaking it into two categories. Linsey explained the importance of process, and most of this is encompassed in compliance-based monitoring. Compliance-oriented monitoring is focused on the fundamentals. This means reviewing reports to ensure that the portfolio remains aligned with policy. Reports should be transparent and easy to understand. Last spring, I had the opportunity to sit down with a CFO who was a little concerned about his portfolio. The report that the committee was receiving read a little more like a statement. It included asset values, but no reference to policy targets. A custom broad market benchmark, but it didn't tie back to policy. Upon closer review, we realized the portfolio had significant concentration risk that was outside the guidelines of the investment policy, but it wasn't easy to discern on the committee's report. Good reporting should make it easy for committee members to implement compliance-oriented monitoring. This should be complemented with practice-oriented monitoring. This involves taking a step back and making sure that the portfolio is still on track to reach that destination. And here I'll offer you the example of a higher ed endowment. Now, this group was engaged in great compliance-oriented monitoring. Asset values were good versus the policy targets. The portfolio was exceeding the policy benchmark, but things looked a little different for the organization. Enrollment was kind of low after COVID, giving had declined, and as a result, they'd increased the draw rate from their portfolio. By engaging in practice-oriented monitoring, the committee realized the asset allocation in their portfolio wasn't on track to reach the organization's goals. We made some adjustments to make sure that the portfolio was in fact aligned with the new spending rate. As a best practice, committees should engage in compliance and practice-oriented monitoring, checking the details while keeping an eye on the destination. Now, once you've done all this work, it's important to document it. This plays a really important compliance role, but more importantly, helps preserve the institutional memory of the organization as staff members change and committee terms roll over. Good committee meeting minutes and good document retention processes are key to this. Minutes should include key details and should also probably be concise. Documents should be stored electronically and accessible and easy to find for all committee members. Now, during COVID, I had a couple committees experience elevated turnover. And this is pretty disruptive when you're actually trying to get things done. We worked with staff to develop orientations that included key details of the investment program, brought them up to speed on the investments, and gave them a little history, And what this did was allowed the committee members to step into their first meeting armed with a little background of the investment program and really ready to contribute. If you don't already have one of these orientations in place, I'd gladly volunteer your Marquette consultant to help you with that assignment next time the need arises. Finally, we've reached the peak of the pyramid. It's incredibly important that committee members carve out time for ongoing education enrichment. And thanks, by the way, because you're already taking one day out of your busy schedules to do that with us today. And I think after all that oversight and governance, if done correctly, education can actually be pretty refreshing. It's gonna look a little different based on the type of portfolio you're working with, what kind of governing body might govern that portfolio, the backgrounds and interests of your committee members. Common things we talk about with our clients would be ERISA, MIFA, fiduciary education deep dives, market insights. I know a lot of our consultants and research team have spent time talking about private credit and AI with our clients over the last couple years, as well as manager refreshers. Most of my clients have at least 10 to 12 managers in their portfolio, if not more, and that's a lot to keep track of. I've worked with one board chair for over a decade. He's a great guy, retired. He went to New York over the summer with his wife, and they decided to make time in the afternoon to sit down with our portfolio's infrastructure manager. They had a nice lunch. He came back, and his review of the fund was, I like what was in the fund, but it's not what I thought it was. Now, this guy was part of the hiring decision, but it was 12 years ago, and memories fade. So I think him coming back to the committee, having a deeper understanding of that fund really allowed him to contribute, ask good questions, and resulted in a deeper sense of buy-in. So again, thanks for coming here today and making a little space for enrichment. Wrapping up, we'll leave you with a couple key points. First, as Linsey explained, the fiduciary role comes with important responsibilities. These responsibilities are grounded in the duty of loyalty and prudence toward your ultimate beneficiaries. Second, process is key to fulfilling these duties. This is achieved by clearly setting that objective and through really diligent oversight. Finally, we recognize that this is a lot of responsibility, and we hope the framework we walked through here today will help you be a good fiduciary. With that, we'll hand it over to Greg to take us to our next topic, the changing face of real estate.